Swedish population allows itself to be led around by the nose by the current globalist government that is ruling the country. What we're seeing right now across much of Europe is a last desperate attempt by the globalist ruling elites, whether they're in Brussels or Paris, London or Berlin, and obviously in Stockholm and Copenhagen, try to create the illusion of a war that diverts attention from the disastrous policies inside the countries that we just mentioned. Now, I don't know what's happening in Sweden, but I can tell you that in Great Britain, of course, you had almost 1 million people on the streets of London protesting against the Starmer government. I think the Starmer government's days are numbered. Now, why? Is it because the Starmer government is somehow or another demanding war between Britain and Russia? No, I think they want to get rid of the Starmer government because the British people have increasingly concluded accurately that their enemy is not in Russia. Their enemy is not on the European continent. Their enemy is inside their own country. And that enemy is primarily their government that has invited millions of people into the country who have nothing in common with the people that live there, who are fundamentally different, who can never assimilate, and if anything, have come there to assimilate the British people, destroy their national identity, their culture, their way of life. This is sinking in with the French. It's sinking in even with the Germans, who are almost as blindsided by their media as the Swedes are and the Danes. But the Germans are finally figuring it out. This big lie that Putin was ever interested in moving much beyond what he's already got is finally gaining attention. Putin reacted to a very dangerous threat to Russia. Putin did not wake up suddenly in the morning and decide, I'm invading eastern Ukraine. And the areas that he occupies are historically and contemporaneously overwhelmingly Russian in culture and language and ethnicity. So I think the big lie is coming apart now. I don't know what's happening in Sweden, but the Swedes had better wake up because there is no reason for hostility and conflict with Russia. There just isn't. There is even
No,
less.
but they're doing everything they can to do that, to provoke by selling. I mean, we have a quite a large defense industry or a war industry, Saab, Ericsson, and Bofors, and all what we in co-partners cahoots with BAE, British Aerospace. We have investments heavily in Rheinmetall, which makes ammunition and guns for battle tanks and all what have you, and we're sending them to the tune of 100 billion, I should say, 100 billion Swedish krona directly to Zelensky and the weapons that he asks for. So if that is not a provocation, I don't know what.
Well, it's a provocation, but that war is largely lost. Zelensky has no chance of succeeding at all, and he knows that. That's one of the reasons that Mr. Zelensky has an estimated 1.1 billion in cash, dollars in cash, sitting in various bank accounts. I'm sure he's got a private plane ready to take off at a moment's notice, and then he'll retire to his various estates. He's got a $15 million estate south of Naples, Florida. He has another estate in Italy. This Ukrainian state in general is an organized crime state.
Hmm.
And it spent most of its time stealing as much as it possibly could from the United States and Europe. Now, some of that money, of course, is recycled. I don't know how it works for the Swedes, but in the United States, a lot of the money never reaches Ukraine because it's simply earmarked or designated to purchase equipment. So the equipment is purchased at home and then shipped overseas. Relatively little cash goes with it. Most of the cash is then recycled into the shareholders, the people that have investments in the defense industry, and ultimately into the pockets of members of Congress.
Hmm.
So it's a sort of form of legalized corruption. I don't know to what extent that is also an
I would
operation.
call it racketeering.
Well, we just refer to it as legalized corruption
Hmm.
because Congress has worked very hard to create the loopholes that allows itself to enrich itself. I mean, this is why people show up in Washington that might be worth a couple of $100,000. By the time they leave after 4 years or 6 years in Washington, they're millionaires.
Hmm.
So politics in the United States is an exercise in self-enrichment. Now, the point is that the war in Ukraine is lost, and people continually ask, well, since the Russians have won and they've killed between 1.7 and 1.8 million Ukrainians, thanks in large part to our stupidity, because our senior military leaders, largely American and British, have been advising the Ukrainians who've been only too willing to send millions of their citizens to die pointlessly in a fight they can't win in eastern Ukraine. But the point is that there's almost nothing left in terms of manpower, and the manpower that remains is trying to get out of the country or is hiding from the government. Internal polling in Ukraine, which never reaches the West, unfortunately, or doesn't, if it does, it's just ignored, is overwhelmingly against this war and desperately wants peace. So then the next question is, well, if the Russians have done these things that are so successful and they've taken few casualties, we estimate that compared to 1.7 to 1.8 million dead, the Russian army has sustained perhaps 120,000 dead. So that gives you some appreciation for the exchange ratio, which is not good. But the point is, if this is true, why hasn't Russia crossed the Dnieper River? Why haven't they marched into Kiev? Why aren't they headed further west? Well, I think Putin understands that he is interested first and foremost in avoiding a war with the United States and NATO. And he realizes that if he were to cross that river and suddenly take the city of Kiev, that this would reinforce the lie that somehow or another he's interested in conquering territory further west, which he's not.
Hmm.
Now, there are a couple of areas left that I think the Russians will seize because historically they're Russian. One is Odessa, which has never been part of Ukraine, and the other, of course, is Kharkov.
Hmm.
And they were always Russian-speaking cities. But other than that, Putin has been pretty flexible about the rest of the territory, but he's going to secure what he thinks he needs to because he doesn't want to fight another war when this one ends. That's his goal. This is it. I need a zone of protection, of security. And the sad part is that Ukraine needs the same thing, and they can get that through neutrality. Finnish neutrality worked very, very well. Swedish neutrality worked very, very
It worked
well.
for 200 years.
Austrian neutrality worked very, very well.
Yeah.
The point is that there is no rush to war that is indicated by anything happening today. So they somehow or another, the Swedish people have to catch up and understand the big lie they've been told is just that. It's a big lie. And they need to throw out this globalist government. They need to focus on protecting their women, protecting their families, protecting themselves at home, and expel much of this population that has come into the country that is hateful and is criminal. And I think that's
Hmm.
well known in Sweden. So it's time to wake up and come to terms with reality. I don't know how else to say it.
No, it's very, very good that you do this. And from my side, Swedish people, I love them. I am from here. I lived in the United States. I lived in Russia. I've been all over the world. I'm a military diver. Has a lot of baggage. I love Sweden, and I cannot understand why the Swedish government and the media, I mean, they're duping Swedish people in that Russia is some kind of enemy all the time. And now the Danish are, if you look at this map again, if I put it up one more time, you have this little island out off of the Swedish coast down here called Bornholm.
Bornholm, yeah.
Yeah, it belongs to Denmark, but it's close to Sweden. It's about an hour ferry travel from Ystad, southern Swedish mainland, over to Bornholm. I went there this summer, and over to Germany, it's a 2 or 3 hour ferry ride. So, and we have Gotland over here, Ireland, which is basically just off the coast. Why do they think We're going to go at war with Russia. I mean, that's the common sense. And if you look at the politicians in the Swedish parliament, I have a Swedish flag over here, and they have a Ukrainian flag.
Yeah.
What
Well,
the fuck?
this is widespread inside the Beltway and Capitol Hill. More and more Americans have come to terms with reality, but we still have some hardcore fools who think that by dumping billions of dollars into Ukraine that they've done something noble and good. All they've done is fuel more criminality and organized crime. And they've ensured that more Ukrainians died pointlessly. The Ukrainians themselves are no longer delirious and delusional. Most of the Ukrainian population has figured out what's happened and they'd like to end it as soon as possible. So would the Russians, by the way, but not because Russia is weak. Remember all the silly stories told about Russia. You know, I remember listening to some member of the Senate in the United States back in the spring of 2022 say that the Russian position is so weak that they are stripping washing machines of spare
I
parts
was
and
gonna say that even Ursula von der Leyen went
well,
out and said the same thing. They're putting together old refrigerators, washing machines to rebuild them into rockets. That's
well, I watched the Russian military capability very, very seriously.
Mhm.
And I can tell you that it is extraordinarily modern, that they are light years ahead of us in their thinking as well as in the production of military technology. We are involved in a giant paradigm shift in military affairs. The Russians have figured it out. They began figuring this out in the 70s. It's now come to fruition. We're still out of touch. We're still organized to refight World War II. And the future will not look like the Second World War. The second thing, though, that's most important is that the Russians, they have their own interests. They preeminently want to do business. And we have effectively urinated in their faces. And so now they've turned their attentions to Asia, where they have found
exactly.
not just in China, also in India. I mean, recently we offended the Indian government. We said that if you buy oil and gas from the Russians, that we'll punish you with a 50% tariff. Well, we lost sight of something. And the something is that we are no longer the largest market in the world. We're not the only game in town. And so that's why you saw the Indian leadership, President Modi, show up in China,
Hmm.
along with President Xi and President Putin. And that little triumvirate right there comes close to 35% of global gross domestic product. And when you look at purchasing power parity, you put India and China together, and it's twice what we have in terms of purchasing power.
Hmm.
That we haven't even included the rest of the world. The rest of the world is turning away from us because they see us as bullies. And they're tired of being bullied by our financial system. They're tired of our debt. And we pass that debt whenever we pass dollars to people. The dollar itself is in a lot of trouble because the world is de-dollarizing. They're moving away from it. See, the problem for President Trump and his colleagues, regardless of party inside Washington, D.C., is that they're trapped in a time warp. They think it's 1990, 1991. They haven't figured out the world has changed dramatically. So I don't know what to tell the Swedish people except that you've got to search for the truth because you're not going to get it from your government. The
No.
people ruling you, the people ruling in Berlin, the people ruling in Paris and London, the people ruling, sadly, in places like Estonia and, of course, in Brussels, these people are frankly corrupt. They are on their last legs. They are targeted, I wouldn't say targeted, but they're scheduled for extinction. Globalism has failed. And remember that this entire war was really about destroying Russia because it was a national state, a state with a strong national identity and a foundation of Orthodox Christianity. Those things were unacceptable to the globalists who are essentially the modern equivalent of Bolsheviks. They're just trying to destroy national borders, national culture, national identity. This is not the future. It's the past. It's a dead end. The Swedes need to come to terms with that. Now, you mentioned the Danes. I was surprised when I received an article this morning from a friend over in Scandinavia, in fact, in Finland. And this particular story talked about the Danes cooperating with the French in an exercise at sea near Greenland, which was aimed at Russia. You know,
Yeah.
the real question people have to ask themselves is where is the evidence? Show me the evidence for the assertions and the allegations that are made against the Russians. Your government and the ruling elites in Western Europe don't have it. This is Orban's argument. This is what he's been saying in Hungary. It's what Fico says in Slovakia.
Right.
And I think the new president in Poland, Nawrocki, he's moving cautiously, but he's moving in the direction of Orban. But
Mm.
he's still as globalist controlling the parliament. This man, Donald Tusk, is still the prime minister. These people will be gone. Now, there's one other final point that people don't seem to understand, and that is that at least we in the United States, and I would argue certainly London and Paris and Berlin, but we are in a lot of trouble financially.
Mhm.
Now, this national sovereign debt is not a small matter. It's treated in a rather cavalier fashion. But the truth is, we can't grow. You know, we're up to 125% of gross national product as a percentage.
Yeah, as a debt. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can't grow our way out of this. We have to
No.
cut spending. And I don't know how this is going to happen. I think eventually we're going to have to default. And we've done this twice before. This is what most people don't understand. We did it twice during the Depression. And but
1929.
after 1929, 34,
Mm.
36, we could not pay our creditors. And FDR sent the Secretary of the Treasury, Morgantown, to meet with the creditors. And the creditors said, all right, we understand that. We'll restructure
Mm.
your payment schedule and so forth. Now, why did they do that? Because at the time, the United States had the largest manufacturing base in the world.
Exactly. They had
Also
real
had-
value.
right. We also had the largest skilled labor force in the world.
Mhm.
Today, we do not. So we're not in much of a position to turn to our creditors and ask forgiveness or help or assistance. In fact, we're already seeing the opposite. Nobody is going to buy our debt. Our treasuries are being dumped all over the world. London is in a similar position, so is Paris, and so is Berlin.
Mm.
Once this financial crisis strikes, and the people running the financial system are in league with the people trying to instigate hostility and conflict with Russia. But once that financial pillar in this larger travesty falls apart, then you will see dramatic change. And the people that are in the streets today will no longer be peaceful in any sense of the word. They will be angry and violent. That's coming soon in Paris and London. It will eventually reach us.
Mm.
People are going to start asking hard questions. You know, the average American is completely disinterested in what happens overseas in most cases. You know
Yeah,
that from having lived
I
here.
know that for a fact. I lived in California. All right.
Right. Well, God bless you. You came out all right. But the point is that the future of our country right now looks bleak because the people in Washington until very recently have looked at Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City as the future. Well, that's no future at all. That's disastrous. That's uncontrolled criminality. It's the destruction of our country. This is going to have to be met head on by the American people. It's coming. We're just at the beginning.
Mm.
So, bottom line is no, we're not going to war with Russia. Trump is trying to wiggle his way out of the situation that his predecessor put him in. He hasn't done it very well. He doesn't know how to do it. But if you can't read the tea leaves, then you must be blind because we are not going to go to war with Russia. We are not going to commit forces to Eastern Ukraine. And keep something else in mind. The British, if they were lucky, could put 20,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine. The French, maybe 30,000. These are Lilliputian armies with no capability whatsoever to fight the Russian military establishment. We need to drop all this nonsense and drop it quickly. And then we need to reopen negotiations with the Russians to restart normal commerce, normal business, normal relations. It can all be done, but we've got to get rid of these people who are in charge. And
Yeah.
I think we will. But I hope the Swedes figure this out sooner rather than later because
We have an election coming up in exactly 1 year from now in 2026. And me and my colleague Øystein Rønne, who has another channel, he lives on the island of Bornholm. Actually, he's a Swede, but he lives on that little speck of land in the Baltic Sea, and is affected by all of this. And we said to each other, we actually made a fictitious video where we saw where the Swedish people had woken up and voted out all these idiots that think that NATO is great, the European Union is great, which is not. Sweden has all the things we need. We could be the most prosperous if we didn't join NATO, if we didn't join the European Union. This country has all the resources, all the energy we need. We have nuclear power. We have the rivers. We have hydroelectric plants, technology, everything. We don't need those fuckers down in the Mediterranean.
Well, Hakan, keep something else in mind. NATO is disintegrating behind the scenes. They can't afford to spend as lavishly on the military as they now say they want to. The populations in Germany, France, and Great Britain are completely disinterested in being suited up for war and marching into Ukraine to fight
Yeah.
the Russians. It's a lot of nonsense. They need access to cheap energy. They need to bury this hatchet as quickly as possible. The Finns, in particular, I've watched Finland a lot because the Finns, I thought, had by far one of the most lucrative and positive economic relationships with Russia of anybody.
Oh, yeah.
Finland has done a lot of damage to itself. It's in trouble economically now as a result of the
Yeah,
way
but
it's.
they have an idiot called Alexander Stubb uh, in charge.
Well,
I mean, there is a movie, Dumb Dumber,
yeah,
that was
yeah,
portrayed by Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels. Then
yes,
you
yeah.
can put Alexander Stubb, the Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, Ursula von der Leyen, and Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron. And you have to only film them live. You get a film called Dumb Dumber.
Well, remember that people like George Soros, wealthy billionaires who are big advocates for the destruction of Western civilization and have pushed globalism, which is another form, as I said earlier, a more modern form of Bolshevism. This group of people are all products of that gene pool, if you will. They've come up through that, and they have also become rich. They have profited. You know, one of my favorite examples of this sort of thing is a complete disaster. Is this man Carl Bildt? He was just in somewhere, I think, in Ukraine, at a press conference with General Petraeus, a man who's never been under fire, never led anybody under fire, whose concept of war is approving PowerPoint slides and long-range strikes against people that have no means of defending themselves.
Yeah.
And the two of them sat there and said, well, the answer for Ukraine is to double down and keep on doing what we've done, only send more money. Sheer unadulterated lunacy. Well, you know, the Russians are losing. I mean, look, they're not advancing. No, 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 they're losing, or they'd already be on the other side of the river. No understanding at all of what Russian goals have been. No understanding of President Putin's very wise exercise of restraint. I mean, there is really nothing now to stop the advance of Russian military power in Eastern Europe.
No,
Zero.
but they're still taking it easy. That's a famous Eagles song rang, taking it easy. I mean, like you're saying, you have such insight of this, and I have it as well as I can get information. There is no purpose for the Russians, military strategist or Putin or Lavrov or Peskov or whatever. They have no interest in governing Western Ukraine because they know they. I mean, my good friend, former banker Mats Palsvig, who is married to a Russian lady, lived in Copenhagen before.
Mhm.
Now he lives in Bulgaria. He speaks fluent Russian, and he says, "I can understand Ukrainian." There's just a little bit of difference in it's like you and I can understand Daniel Davis with his southern twang. He says that it's not a big difference, but there's an identity difference. People, some people in Ukraine, which is a large country, see themselves as Russian, and some see them as something else than Russian. It's
Yeah, I
not
mean,
the
most
language,
people,
really.
I grew up with Ukrainians in Philadelphia.
All right.
I loved them. They were wonderful people. These people had come over before and after World War II. Some had come over, right after the First War or during the First War. But their spoken Ukrainian had a great deal of Polish in it, as well as German.
Hmm.
When you're in Western Ukraine, in a place like Lvov, which they call Lviv now, which was for a couple of hundred years almost Lemberg under the Austrians.
Right.
They they are very different. There is no question about it. President Putin has spoken about this openly,
Hmm.
and he made it very clear. He says he's not a fool. He knows these people don't want to be ruled by us, and we don't want to rule them.
They might be interested in me ruling by Poland or Hungary.
Well, actually speaking, that came up, and the joke was that let the Poles have them, because historically, if there's one group of people the Ukrainians murdered routinely and hated, it's the Poles.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a very difficult group of people in Western Ukraine, and yes, you have some Hungarians living in Western Ukraine. They were stuck there after the First World War.
Right.
So much damage was done to us as a result of these world wars we can't even begin to imagine. And you can see that now in Ukraine, where you see this ridiculous renaissance of Nazi symbolism, and you see some of the same thing in response to it that goes back to Stalin. It's bad. It's bad news. It all
Right.
needs to go away. We should be working hard to facilitate, an end of this as soon as possible. But we're not. We're actually doing our part to keep it going. Now, President Trump may think that by telling the Europeans, if you want us to continue, then you have to make permanent enemies of Russia, that's a clever way to get out of this. I don't think he understands the people in charge. They are simply not salvageable. And I'm talking about your globalist elites. You've got to get rid of them. I have to be very frank. They need
Yeah.
to be expelled from your
I
government.
think what you pointed out many times is that Donald Trump has bad advisors. Uh, I mean, that's like putting the blame on somebody else. But if you listen to, I mean, I listen to Pete Hegseth, I listen to people around Donald Trump. They don't make sense.
Well, none of them seem to have a grasp of what they do. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that President Trump, who has a better understanding of the domestic scene, clearly, is still in over his head in foreign and defense policy, and I would argue also in the financial world.
Hmm.
And I don't know what is going to happen to him when this financial system, this house of cards that we built, collapses. But I suspect he's going to be blamed for everything. He certainly deserves some of it, but this is something that's taken years to build up. We have been mismanaged in so many ways for so long. At some point, it all has to collapse, and I think it will. But in the meantime, what I tell every European who cares to listen is think first and foremost of what your country's interests are. Washington used to say, no nation state can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests.
Okay.
We have been demanding for decades that our so-called partners and allies do things that were counterproductive for them, that were not in their interests. It's time to stop. We need to come home and deal with our own problems, which are substantial. And you need to get on with things on your own. NATO is disintegrating. It may not seem that way in the papers in Sweden, but it is. And the EU isn't going to last another year. All of these institutions are crumbling, and that's because they are not founded on reality. They're not based on anything that makes sense. The Swedes have to determine who they share a commonality of interest with. That's important.
Hmm.
Those are the people you need to cooperate with. But as Charles de Gaulle said very famously in the 1960s, no one would listen to him. He said, the Americans do not live in Europe. Britain is an island. Wake up. In other words, they should not be meddling in Europe and our affairs. And I strongly subscribe to that. It's time for you to take charge of your own future. Stop listening to us. Stop listening to this false ideology of globalism that is destructive to your interests. I hope you do, because if you don't, things will not improve. They'll get a lot.